I'm sorry, Chelsea fans. Despite winning the Champions League against Pep Guardiola's Manchester City just a couple years ago, whilst also being a favourite for the league title year in, year out, you now find yourselves disappointed for the second year running, sitting in the bottom half of the table. And despite being safe for another 12 months, the threat of a points deduction hangs over your heads, which could spell relegation for the club, begging the question of what on earth is happening at Chelsea FC. How can one of the most expensive squads ever assembled be fighting mid-table in the Premier League? Well, let me tell you all about it. Back in 2003, they were bought for £140 million by then unknown Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich. This was the moment Chelsea changed forever. Over his 19-year reign of the club, he injected an astonishing £2 billion and fundamentally began shaping a new era of footballing ownership. During that time, he hired 14 managers, totally going against the precedent set by the likes of Arsene Wenger and Sir Alex Ferguson that a manager was the glue that held together a footballing dynasty. Nonetheless, it worked with great effect, as Chelsea soon knocked those at the top of English football off their perch, winning 21 trophies, with just some being 5 Premier Leagues and FA Cups, including 1 double, 3 League Cups, 2 Europa Leagues and 2 Champions Leagues. And following the 2021 season, it looked as if that success had no sign of ending. But then, in a matter of months, the club would never be the same again. Abramovich's connections to Putin meant that he was forced by the UK to sell the club and leave. Just hours after war broke out, he was accused of helping fund political influence, leading to him being sanctioned. He had his assets frozen and was never to step foot in Stamford Bridge again. Fast forward a few months and the club was sold for a record-breaking £4.25 billion, with American businessman and investor Todd Boehly coming in as the new owner and perceived saviour of Chelsea. He was the light at the end of the tunnel during a time where many fans wondered if they'd ever be able to watch their team play again after having merchandise stores closed down and matchday tickets unavailable to buy. Along with the sale of Chelsea was a pledge by Todd Boehly to invest £1.75 billion in the coming years to the team and infrastructure. Well, just over a year and a bit after taking over the then champions of Europe, he's already sunk over £1 billion into transfers alone and ran through 4 managers. And that is where the problems begin. Now, the issues present at Chelsea are nothing new. In fact, there is a case study already available that is 10 years deep into its cycle of failure that can be looked at to learn what's going wrong for the blue side of London: Manchester United. Following the departure of Sir Alex Ferguson, Manchester United have been in an endless loop of disappointment, but not for the lack of money spent, that's for sure. Much like Todd Boehly's Blues, the Red Devils have spent over £1.5 billion on transfers since Fergie, yet they've seen the odd League Cup, FA Cup or Europa League whilst barely scraping the top 4 here and there during that time in return. How? Roman Abramovich and later Manchester City proved that money solves all problems, right? Wrong. Money is the easy part when it comes to running a successful football club, and that is what Ed Woodward, the Glazers and now Todd Boehly have failed to understand. An investment of £1 billion is not an investment without a vision, it's a waste. And this is where both clubs have gone wrong. And that was clear the moment Todd came in. He wanted to kick off his first summer at the club with a blockbuster statement signing, and there's none much better than signing Cristiano Ronaldo from your rivals. And that is exactly what he wanted, despite Thomas Tuchel being dead against such a move, as well as many other staff members at the time. And so, like any good owner would, he listened to the man in charge of the football, deciding to not pursue Ronaldo. However, it would be made clear just a few months later that Todd Boehly's loyalty to footballing men wasn't as sincere as it was perhaps made out to be. The Times claimed that Boehly talked with Tuchel over his transfer strategy, stating that he believed that the club needed a midfield overhaul. This was in stark contrast to Tuchel's opinion, as he believed a midfield of Jorginho, Mateo Kovacic, N'Golo Kante and the newly emerging Conor Gallagher was enough for another summer. Instead, he preferred to spend the funds on defensive reinforcements after losing Andreas Christensen and Antonio Rudiger. Now, Boehly did give Tuchel some defenders, signing Koulibaly and Fofana. However, behind his back, he also brought in Dennis Zakarian Zakaria on loan, a midfielder that Tuchel didn't even recognise in training the following day. This is why the Swiss international barely ever played for the Blues, as he was never part of a well thought out footballing operation in tandem with the manager's vision. This is something that has happened time and time again at Manchester United. Whilst at Molde, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer offered United the opportunity to sign a certain Erling Haaland for £4 million. Nonetheless, they ignored him despite later bringing him in as caretaker, then going on to make him permanent. Then, when Ole did get the chance to bring Haaland to the Red Devils like he'd always wanted, the club rejected it a second time as the striker's agent back then, Mino Raiola, wanted to include a buyout clause. Instead, the club went and got Odion Ighalo on loan and are still to this day, years later, looking for a striker. That is the type of people you've got making decisions at these clubs. People who think they know better than the actual men they hired to do the footballing job. In fairness to Todd though, Tuchel wasn't the man he hired, and so he needed a reason to change that. Tuchel had won only 3 out of 7 games so far that season. However, according to reports, that wasn't the only reason he sacked the Champions League winning coach. It stated that at halftime during Tuchel's final Premier League game with the score 1-1, Bohley tried to invite himself and some guests, including children, into the dressing room. Now obviously this is just utterly ridiculous, and Tuchel knew that, not allowing it, thus embarrassing the owner in the process by sending him and his friends back to their seats. Disagreements, differing transferring strategies, and poor performances saw Tuchel removed from his position, with Chelsea sat in 6th place with only 10 points after a possible 18. Little did they know though that it'd be the highest Chelsea would be for the rest of the season, with those 10 points being the difference between them and relegation. And so it's no surprise that Todd Boehly reportedly accepted that he made a mistake, understanding that it was probably best to allow Tuchel to see out the rest of the season before his dismissal following Graham Potter's time at Chelsea. Oh yes, Potter. This was one of the greatest examples in football of what not to do if you want to create a new footballing dynasty. He has the joint lowest points average of any Chelsea manager to be in charge for 20 or more games, with just 1.27 per match. Now Potter was brought in as Boehly's guy, the man to lead a new era at Chelsea, one that looked at the long term. Heck, maybe 7 months is a long time for a Chelsea manager really, but one thing is for sure, the plan was for it to be much longer. However, one of the main reasons behind his failure was actually due to the amount of players in the squad. There were 36 in total, with Potter using 32 throughout his time at the club, meaning he never named an unchanged 11 once during his entire time there. That is ridiculous considering one of the core fundamentals of any successful team is building a spine that can rely on week in, week out, built on consistency. Nonetheless, Boehly's love for splashing cash saw Chelsea become bloated with young players with big egos and even larger contracts. And because of this, unrest within the squad was guaranteed. And much like at United, it will undoubtedly come back to haunt them in the future. Let's take a look at £100 million Enzo Fernandez, for example. The young talent was bought in for an obscene amount of money and is on an eye-watering £315,000 a week. Now, let's be honest, like most of their new signings, it's not gone well. However, what's worse is that he's on an 8-year contract, making him practically immovable. This is another mistake Chelsea have not learned from Manchester United, as they too have spent a stupid amount of money for players that on paper should come good at some point, only for them to never reach that potential and flop. Now let's look at Paul Pogba, for example. He was purchased for a large sum of money. He also found himself on £290,000 per week. That, combined with his poor performances, meant that he was stuck at United, counting down the days until his contract expired, where they would eventually lose him for free. Alexis Sanchez was another, David De Gea, Anthony Martial, just look at Jadon Sancho now as well. These were all players on stupid wages that Manchester United failed to move on because no other club are willing to pay even remotely close to what they were on. And this is the same issue that Chelsea will find themselves in when it's time to call it a day on some of these failed transfers. Cucurella has 5 years left and takes home 175k each week. Reece James too, for as good as he is when he plays, he never does. This is another issue as he's on 250 grand a week for another 5 years, whilst their top earner, Raheem Sterling, is on 325 grand a week for the next 4. Caicedo and Mudryk's deals also have 8 years left on them too. Every name I mentioned there will be nigh on impossible to sell if the club wants to, because of the corner they backed themselves into with the contracts they dished out, unless they are lucky enough to be bailed out by Saudi Arabia once again. But if not, they will end up being held for ransom and at best be on loan until their contracts expire, and this will have huge knock-on effects for each manager that comes in, as they will be forced to work with a mixed match of other managers' players like at Manchester United. They'll be unable to move forward due to past mistakes. A well-run team, on the other hand, would be one like City. They get the players the manager wants. Even before Pep Guardiola officially signed, they got his targets ready. For example, players like Raheem Sterling and Kevin De Bruyne were targets of Pep's buying team, yet they just so happened to end up at City just before he joined instead. And because they keep their contracts sensible, when a player does fail, they can afford to replace them adequately. Now, of course, the 115 charges above their head raises some question marks about how well run the club really is. However, there's no denying that their approach is much more sensible for when it comes to building a team, rather than Chelsea's approach of building a collection of good players. Bringing me onto Poch. Like I said, Bohley at least seems to have understood that his new era of Chelsea has been nothing short of an embarrassment, with the sacking of Potter basically being a public admission of this. He also managed to solve the large squad issue by sending most of them on a permanent holiday to Saudi Arabia. Yet, things are still going terribly. After 15 games of the 22-23 season, Poch's Blues somehow had 5 less points than they did the season before. As you'd imagine, fans were not happy. Thus, after a less than impressive defeat to a struggling Manchester United, fans could be heard booing at Old Trafford. When asked about if success would one day return, Poch said, "Maybe not now, but for sure in the future, who knows?" Now, part of the reason contributing to Chelsea's recent failure under Poch stems from the age of the squad. It is the youngest in the league, and whilst they're all undoubtedly talented, that talent will only take you so far unless you have experience there to guide it the rest of the way. Take, for example, possibly the most famous young squad of them all, Manchester United's class of 92. They still had the likes of Steve Bruce, Gary Pallister, Dennis Irwin, Eric Cantona and Mark Hughes in the squad, full of experience at the very top. This is what Chelsea is lacking. Thiago Silva aside, the next best player when it comes to experience is probably Reece James, who himself is not only young but also incredibly injury prone. Things only seem to get worse for Chelsea though, following the risk of a points deduction regarding allegations of breaching profitability and sustainability rules. Now, in fairness, this has nothing to do with Bohley, as the investigation is to do with Abramovich's time at the club. Funnily enough, it was actually Bohley that brought the breaches to the attention of the Premier League, which is a bit of a red flag if I'm honest. Stinks very much of, well, if I tell them and be honest, maybe we can get off nicely, making it seem like something very dodgy is afoot. Nonetheless, they've managed to avoid punishment for at least another 12 months it seems. But basically, to sum it all up briefly, The Guardian reported about how hidden payments linked directly to Chelsea's footballing operations were made. Now, what exactly does that even mean? Well, essentially, Chelsea had paid funds that helped them, such as paying agent fees for players and managers, using offshore companies owned by Roman Abramovich. These were completely third-party companies that had nothing to do with Chelsea. Yet, they were still paying agents millions of pounds, which is always pretty sus to say the least. Now, the reason behind these fees is supposedly footballing advice. That is how they've been trying to get away with it. And if that's the case, then Bohley could really do with getting a number. But in reality, I think anyone with half a brain cell can guess that this football advice does not exist, and is instead just a nice payday for agents getting their players to Chelsea. Now, the punishment, if found guilty for this, is either a hefty fine or a points deduction. However, Everton recently got charged with a very similar breach and saw themselves get docked 10 points. If Chelsea were to be docked 10 points, if not more, it would be catastrophic for them, and with the way they've been going the last couple of seasons, would see them sucked into a potential relegation battle. After all, remember that those 10 points were the difference between them and getting relegated last year. Luckily for them, they've at least shown that they can get a few good results together and go on a decent run when required. Nonetheless, I expect them to go through many years similar to what United have gone through for the foreseeable future, enjoying the odd Carabao or FA Cup, but ultimately being left like you're far away from the glory days. Now, if you've gotten this far in the video, you might enjoy this one on your screen right now. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to ding that notification bell.